we have this whole medical history with my daughter, and we've been deeply entrenched in this world of medical conditions and disabilities ever since she entered our lives. And I knew from early on that I had to find other people because I had no experience. Playground, in my personal experience, is going to be usually at least $200,000 to $300,000. And that's kind of like on the smaller end, like a small inclusive playground, right? And so some of these ones that are larger can easily go beyond $500,000, $1 million if it's a really large one.
Maybe to the extent we see it today, but for them to just grow up knowing like accessibility and inclusion and different diagnoses and being patient and just being kind, that they don't see it like as an extra thing because they're living with it every day. But for them to notice that, I know they're going to be amazing advocates. Hello, AGSAA and caregivers. You're listening to the Rare Advocacy podcast, brought to you by Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome Advocacy Association. I'm Betty, your host and mom of Noah, who has Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome. A special thanks to our podcast sponsor, Biogen, who continues to help us with this podcast. So join us for insightful conversations and updates about Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome, rare diseases, and disabilities. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. This really helps spread awareness. So if you haven't done this, just take a brief moment and share your review on whatever platform you're listening to us from. And don't forget, we're here to support you every step of the way, and we'll make a difference together. And now I'm going to go ahead and bring my next guest into the screen. Her name is Stephanie. Stephanie, how are you doing today?
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for asking. How are you?
Good. I am happy to have you because we've met each other more than months ago. Has it been a year now?
I think, at least a year. I think we've met like the past couple years a lot.
Yes. So just a little background on how I met Stephanie. As a mom of a newly diagnosed kid of a rare syndrome, one of Noah's symptoms was seizures. And then it developed into epilepsy. And obviously, sometimes, you feel like Googling certain topics. And other times, I feel like I need to look for families who might be going through the same things. And that way I can be like, following someone on social media that's more relatable. And that's how I found Stephanie. Unfortunately, I wish I could not be meeting people this way because I wish no one had seizures. But Stephanie was just so nice. She welcomed me into her community. She was so nice and welcoming me. And she, one of the things that I found so helpful, Stephanie, is that you were not only willing to share your experience, and you're going to tell us a little bit more about that, but your knowledge. To be like, hey, this is what I know, and I'll answer the questions that I know. And you never said it like, and check with your doctor, but you were just very like honest in front of me, like, hey, this is as much as I can share. And that helped me learn about my other son's diagnosis, which he developed epilepsy into Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And Stephanie, you were just so kind because I was just bombarding you with the questions the whole entire time because, it didn't occur to me until you talked about it. And I was like, wait a minute, I think this is Noah. And sometimes that happens. So Stephanie, my first question with that introduction to you is, tell me a little bit about you and your family and how you came upon this disability community and space.
Sure. Well, so my husband and I have been married now 11 years. We have 3 children. They are ages 10, 8, and 6. And my youngest child is my daughter, Rosalie. She's my 6-year-old, and she is my medically complex and disabled child. So we kind of entered this world of medical complexities when I was pregnant with her. We received a prenatal diagnosis at my 18-week anatomy scan. And so from that point on, we were aware that she had a very severe case of a brain condition called hydrocephalus. And there's nothing you can do in utero to treat hydrocephalus. You can just monitor fluid levels in the brain, kind of keep track of where the levels are at. And with that information, your doctors will kind of figure out at what point should we intervene and have the baby be born, because she needed brain surgery shortly after birth. And so that was kind of her primary diagnosis, if you will. Because her brain was under so much excess fluid due to the hydrocephalus, while she was growing and developing in utero, that put a lot of pressure on her developing brain that can cause all kinds of damage. And you don't really know what the outcome of that is going to be until you meet your child and you kind of start figuring out what they need and where to go from there. And so, she did have brain surgery to place a medical device called a shunt in her brain when she was 2 days old. She's actually had 4 brain surgeries at this point, and then 4 different surgeries not related to her shunt. So she's had a lot of surgeries. We've had a lot of hospital stays and things like that. But her, I guess, next diagnosis that we knew of was her cortical visual impairment, which we learned of when she was a baby. She was about 7 months old. And then as she grew, we just kept watching and paying attention and seeing what else we needed to be addressing. And she did develop epilepsy when she was about 13 months old. And so that's, been in our life since then. And she has mild cerebral palsy. So we actually didn't receive that diagnosis until she was 3 years old. But she does have CP. And then also when she was 3 is when her epilepsy evolved into Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And so, early on, her epilepsy was pretty treatable with medication. But ever since then, it's been a totally different experience with epilepsy. And so I think, long story short, to kind of answer your question, obviously we have this whole medical history with my daughter, and we've been deeply entrenched in this world of medical conditions and disabilities ever since she entered our lives. And I knew from early on that I had to find other people because I had no experience. I didn't have any close friends or family members that knew anything about these specific medical conditions or how it pertained to our situation. And I think that having community, having other parents that you can relate to, like you were saying, just having more relatable friendships with people where we can kind of understand the challenges that one another's facing and support and encourage one another through those things. I recognized early on that was something I absolutely needed. And so I've just kind of been pretty open, I think, along the way with sharing about our journey, because I am so grateful for the people who did that for me when we received our prenatal diagnosis. And then with every diagnosis and every step along the way, there have always been other parents or professionals out there who were willing to chat with me and share about their experiences. And it just helps me so much as a caregiver to have those types of connections.
Yes. You have gone through so much. And I'm always telling parents who I meet, I'm like, I'm so sorry I'm meeting you this way, right? Because we expected this life and then this happened. And so we are just doing the very best for our child. And I could tell that immediately when I first encountered you on Instagram. And the way you tackle everything, Stephanie, is it's your help. I know you're doing whatever you can for your family and that includes your kids and with your husband, but you deciding to be comfortable and share, you're doing a lot for the community. And so I'm very thankful for that, because I know you have impacted my life in many ways, with my son also having CBI and, dealing with seizures. So I thank you on behalf of your community for doing that. And I will definitely share your socials about it. So I know you said, backtracking a little bit, that you wanted to start looking for that community on socials, but what inspired to be like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and specifically start this account to start talking about my daughter and in my experiences as a caregiver, because you have a really nice tone on how you deliver everything. You're just not like focusing so much on her, but you're like, this is how I'm navigating things and this is my approach. And you're just very like welcoming about it and educational about it. So when did you decide, hey, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing this? And then you created additional accounts. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, thank you so much for all your kind words. I feel so validated by you. But I guess from early on, because I realized that I really needed that community, many years ago, I used to have a blog that I wrote, and it was kind of like a newlywed mom blog back when that was a really popular thing. And this was like even prior to Instagram, right? And so there was a part of me that already had an openness to kind of sharing a little bit about our lives. And I saw the value in connecting with other people who also were kind of living a similar life with their marriage and their children and just family life in general. That blog, I actually kind of just retired once things got really hectic with all of Rosalie's medical, issues early on, all those surgeries and things. It became something that was no longer life-giving for me personally because it was too stressful to keep up with it. And so for a while, I just focused on, we have a Caring Bridge website that, is a private site where I share a lot of medical updates with our family and our friends. And I've done that ever since, I was pregnant with her. I kind of focused on that for a little bit. And that's what I needed to do for myself, I think, to just be able to process and keep track of things and have that clarity. And then, as she grew a little bit, one thing that kind of launched me into this path was when we received her CVI diagnosis. This was in 2018. And I am so thankful that there are way more resources out there now for people who receive this diagnosis than what existed in 2018. Because back then, the resources were few and far between. And I was fortunate enough to kind of plug into that community through Facebook groups and, different virtual support groups, things like that. But there wasn't very good information at the time for very young children who had, higher levels of functional vision. I feel like I worked very, very, very hard and intentionally when Rosalie was young to help her improve her functional vision, to really adapt her environment and learning materials for her. So she did make a lot of progress because, of course, with neuroplasticity, the brain is always learning and growing and things like that. But she was this very young child, and I was trying to figure out what to do in our everyday life for her. And most of the resources back then for that level of functional vision were very focused on school-age children.
Okay.
And she was a baby and a toddler back then. So that kind of prompted me to say, you know what? I've read all of these books. I have talked to all of these people. I've scoured the internet for every article, every resource I can find. I have had to learn a lot to help my daughter. And I hate that it's so hard for people to get information. And so back then, I decided to launch a new blog, and that is called everydaycvi.com. And I just share kind of everyday strategies. I haven't been super active in that space in recent years, but I do from time to time post new things. But for a while, that was a real big focus, that I was deeply entrenched in the CVI community and just trying to share, hey, this is what we do. This is what has worked for us. I'm not a professional, but maybe there are other parents out there who would benefit from this. And so at some point, I created an Everyday CVI Instagram page to go along with that. But as Rosalie grew older, and I know this is a really long-winded answer.
It's okay. It's okay.
But as she grew older, I realized that her CVI, the CVI page I had created, I intentionally kept it CVI only because I wanted people to be able to find it who needed this information. And if they were searching for CVI, it would just increase the likelihood they would be able to find it.
Of course.
There are so many other things that we were dealing with as Rosalie's family, and she has all these other medical conditions. And it just got to a point where I felt like, you know what, I need to find people who I can talk to about this, other parents that I can relate to on this journey. And I had some very wonderful friends in my life, still do, who are very supportive, but they themselves don't understand exactly what it's like to be raising a child themselves with all of these medical conditions. And I just kind of got to this point where I said, you know what? I love that I have supportive friends who will listen to me explain all these things about what I'm doing. But I have all this knowledge and life experience that I've gained. I would love to be able to share it or talk about it with other people who could also benefit from this knowledge. And so while my friends were great listeners, it doesn't matter to them about how to change G-tube or, things
They're not
like
going to
that.
use it. Yes.
They just don't need that knowledge. And so I just felt this desire around the time when Rosalie was 3 years old to finally create what is my current social media page, Stephanie Bluebirds, where I talk about just kind of all the medical mom things. And, I've got highlights on there for like every diagnosis and just kind of a little bit of history or things that we've gone through. And it's really allowed me to connect with other families who have shared diagnoses, or maybe they're looking for answers, or maybe they received a prenatal diagnosis and they're terrified, whoever it may be, however they find it. That's kind of what prompted me to put it out there, because it's just, I think of it through the lens of, the content I like to put out there is the type of content that I would want to know. I have a lot of questions when I get a diagnosis or we're deciding on a procedure or between different treatment options and things like that. Like, I have so many questions. And so that's kind of how I approach what I share, is putting things out there that I would want to know or I would need to know, or that I would hope other parents or professionals would tell me that I've discovered along the way. And so I think by doing that, it just allows that information to be shared and utilized by the people who are going to benefit from it most. Hopefully.
Yes. The parents that are living similar paths than, like yours. And then there's something about like, okay, you hear things from a professional, let's say, a health practitioner, but then it's nice to go to another parent or caregiver and be like, hey, not that we're second guessing them, but, it's just different coming from another caregiver and be like, hey, did you also hear about this? And then it might be like, yes, but we heard this other option. And that gives us a little bit of more power and encouragement as an advocate for our kids, because then we can do what's best for our family and for our kiddo, and not necessarily what the research says, because the research doesn't say, hey, for your family, this is good. It just says overall this information based on this many patients. But hey, there's outliers. And some kids are going to, for example, be really good with keto diet. And I know you and I can relate to this, but some of us might be like, hey, not my family, not my kid, didn't work out, right? And so being able to connect with families like yours that are, willing to share all this knowledge and help other families out, it really helps, especially when you're, as responsive as you are and willing to be like, hey, check out my highlights. I have them organized. I'm like, yes. And you see me in the middle of the night clicking through Stephanie's highlights, but it's so, so helpful. And another topic besides seizures and CVI that you helped me with, it's one that you started most recently, and it's very new to me. And that is like accessibility and specifically inclusive playgrounds. And so that's the most recent like project, like niche you started, correct?
Yes, that is.
So tell me about that, because you have a whole lot of experience about that. And so I want to know, obviously with Rosalie's age, but what sparked me like, hey, now I'm going to start talking about this a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I think with all things, whatever I talk about, it just comes from my lived experiences and oftentimes my own challenges or frustrations or obstacles, and then learning how to approach those, how to navigate these things. And so, when Rosalie was younger, I was aware a little bit of inclusive playgrounds because we did live at that time in an area where I was aware of a couple more accessible playgrounds, and they were kind of advertised as such. But when she was really young, she still wasn't at that point of being able to even access those, because we were just doing so many different things with all of her early intervention therapies and trying to build, even enough strength to hold her head up since she was born with such a large, heavy head because of her hydrocephalus. And I was just nowhere near being able to go to a playground and put her on a swing. That was not safe for her. That was not a realistic thing. And so it took time, but basically as she got older and stronger, a little bit more mobile, started using a gait trainer, eventually started using a walker. But still, to this day, we use an adaptive stroller primarily when we're out in public because walking and all those things are pretty fatiguing for Rosalie. But as she grew and became more mobile, I started to see in my own community the total lack of accessibility. And even if I wanted to take her certain places to go play, how was I going to do it? And a perfect example is that when my boys started school, their school playground was kind of where the parents would pick the kids up after school. They would walk each grade out to the parking lot, and they had a different box for each grade level. You'd meet them there where their teacher is, and you'd pick up your kids, but it's right by the playground. So a lot of the school families would stay after school a little bit, let their kids play on the playground, which was wonderful for getting to know other families in the school, being able to socialize. However, the playground had a wooden beam, really thick wooden beam that was a barrier around the entire exterior of the playground. So automatically anybody with a baby stroller or with a wheelchair or a walker, any type of mobility aid, they can't even enter that physical space. And then once you're in there, it was all mulch. There was nothing with, either ramps or something that was kind of like a zero entry type of structure where anybody with mobility aids or specifically a wheelchair would be able to go. And so for a little while, when we were new to the school and I was trying to get to know everybody, I would intentionally stay after school, try and socialize with people, let my boys play, because of course they wanted to do that. And Rosalie was young enough at first, she could kind of hang out in her stroller and play with toys, but she got older and she would get bored and she wanted to go play. And that was a really terrible situation to be in as a mother where, I want to allow my typically developing children the opportunity to socialize with their classmates, with their peers, and have that time to kind of build community. But at the same time, my other child is completely excluded from this total environment. And it just got to the point where I felt like this is not fair for Rosalie. And I don't think this is the best use of our family's time at this point. And so really, I stopped staying after school. And sometimes my boys were disappointed. They're like, can't we stay and play? And, that's hard. But I had to explain, what? There's nothing that Rosalie can play on here. So we should go to this other playground in town, but we'd have to drive across town, to get to it. And then, of course, their friends aren't there. And it became a real pervasive issue, in my personal life every single day that I was having to confront. And so that kind of led me down this path of starting to speak up, to raise awareness within that community, to talk about, accessibility and how we can be more inclusive. I started to get really involved just more as an advocate, trying to raise awareness and then make a change. And I am actually very happy to say that community, because my friend and I pitched the idea for redoing the playground, which was very old and needed to be updated anyway. We pitched the idea of an inclusive playground and they said yes.
I want to hear about that. Yes, I'm so glad you brought it up because that's a successful story. But tell us a little bit more about like the steps that you went through, like, and how much resistance was there, if any. And then another thing maybe our audience would like to know is, was this a public school or a private school? Because I'm sure those are going to be two different things. And if you had to do things different, how would you do them differently? Go ahead.
Yeah, and that is a really important distinction, because I've had people message me over the years saying like, hey, how did you do this? How did you advocate for it? And my first question is always like, is this a public school? Is this a private school?
Yeah.
Because it is going to be totally different, the way that you're going to want to advocate. And so this was actually a private school that my boys were at. And it is a school that was actually on the same campus as the church that our family goes to. Okay. And so this playground was a space that not only did the school use, but the church used it as well for different social events and things, not during school hours, of course, but at other times throughout the year. And so the initial kind of conversation that we had was, and I'm very fortunate that I had a friend who agreed to do this with me. And she actually made the initial pitch after I kind of educated her on a lot of different talking points, because she doesn't have a disabled child, but she wanted to learn. And she was like, how can I help? Because you're swamped right now. And so people out there like that, you need friends like that in your life too. And she really helped support me. And she did kind of the initial pitch, and it was pretty much with all of the big decision makers within that church and school community. And so, it was like the head pastor, the headmaster of the school, the business director for the church, kind of all these people that would be making really big decisions, especially financial decisions, were sitting in on that meeting. And so we were very fortunate that the case that we made, especially because that playground was used for all these other community events, that they agreed that this was a problem, because you're excluding people within your own community who literally cannot access this community space. So thankfully they saw that, they understood that, and they said, yes, we would like to address that and change it. And for a lot of people, the issue comes down to funding so many times, which is so frustrating. This was kind of coming out of the pandemic a little bit. And so what really helped our situation was that the private school and the church had grant money coming out of that one of the things specifically that you could use it for was a playground. Mm-hmm. And so we did not have to do all of the fundraising that I thought that we were going to have to do. And that really sped the process along, because I think that's where, people get stuck for months or even years trying to raise the funds or to get approved for grant.
How expensive is it? Like, what are we talking about? Like, maybe you can share with us if like starting like comparisons, like a playground that's inclusive versus not inclusive. Is there like a huge gap of money difference, or not necessarily? And that's just a misconception.
There's a huge gap. And so that's the excuse that a lot of people give, is the money. So I do just want to give a little plug that if you are trying to advocate for this within, your public school or within your town, through their Parks and Rec department, especially through your Parks and Rec department, those projects through your parks, they're funded using taxpayer money. Mm-hmm. And we're all taxpayers. We all live in these communities, right? And so we all have a right to access. So you can kind of use that as, kind of fuel to the fire when you're
point. Yes.
You're also contributing and paying your taxes. And then with public schools, they have more of a legal obligation to provide access to, kids that have an IEP and things like that. And they do get money from the government. And so the question is, how are they allocating that money that they're getting from the government? And so these are all things to be considered when you're advocating. But there is a big disparity, unfortunately, between kind of a typical playground that you would see versus one that has intentionally accessible and inclusive equipment. Some of it can be pretty pricey. So even a very small inclusive playground, in my personal experience, is going to be usually at least $200,000 to $300,000. And that's kind of like on the smaller end, like a small inclusive playground, right? And so some of these ones that are larger can easily go beyond 500,000, 1 million. If it's a really large one that's maybe like an acre or something like that. I mean, you're talking $1.5 to $2 million, like easily. So that is a huge obstacle often when you are trying to advocate for these places.
So going back to the story, your successful story, you found out you didn't have to fundraise as much money. And so you still did some fundraising, right?
We actually didn't have to end up doing that because they were able to create a design with the playground company that fit within the budget of, it was a pretty large grant that they were receiving. And so I don't remember exactly if it was 250,000 or 300,000, but it was in that ballpark. And they made it work within that budget so that they didn't have to fundraise or pay out of pocket for any of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's such a beautiful story. And I will go ahead and insert here so that when people can see it, like the before and after pictures, because I know you shared those on social media. So I'll get those from you because how was that emotionally for you when it opened? How did you feel?
Well, I wanted to cry, especially just because there are so many places that are not accessible to my family, or, they're accessible to part of my family, but not all of my family. And to have spaces like that within your community where all of your children can play.
Yes.
And everyone can be included. Nobody is stuck sitting on the sidelines or having to go find some alternate activity, but they can actually be around other children and play together. I wish that I saw that more and in more places, but sadly, these places seem to be few and far between. And it is such a gift, not only to my child who is disabled, but also to her brothers who want their sister to be there. They want to play with her. Yeah. They want their friends to know their little sister and not be this unknown person on the sidelines. They want her included. And that's something really beautiful as their mom, to see how they have learned so much through our family's experience and having their little sister, that they are so much more knowledgeable about disability access and inclusion. And they notice when there are ramps or there's not an automatic door, or when somebody is using like the accessible bathroom stall and taking a really long time and they really don't need that stall. Yeah. Like, they can see the injustice of it all, and they are children.
Yes.
But yeah, it's just when you can find these places where your entire family can all be a family and be part of a community, it's really hard to describe what that feels like.
It's so beautiful, and I'm seeing it. My son's a whole lot younger. He's 5. My typical child's 5, and then my disabled kid is he's 2, and it is so neat. And I said this on the podcast before, seeing the siblings all of a sudden, they're growing up with this like new point of view. It's new to us because we didn't see it maybe to the extent we see it today, but for them to just grow up knowing like accessibility and inclusion and different diagnoses and being patient and just being kind, that they don't see it like as an extra thing because they're living with it every day. But for them to notice that, I know they're going to be amazing advocates. I just wish that sometimes, others would take the time to like listen and ask questions, because I know they don't see it every day. So it's a whole lot harder to be engaged with them. But it's really neat when you do find like those friends that you mentioned, that they're like willing to listen and be like, wait, is there something that I can do? And sometimes they can. And it's helpful because you mentioned this, and that leads me to my next question. How hard, and, what tips, or, maybe talk about the challenges that one faces as both as a caregiver and an advocate, because you're a very like you're advocating every day and you're educating people every day, but you also have so many things going on behind the scenes that maybe I can imagine because I'm dealing with it on a daily basis. But sometimes we don't show that, or we don't talk about it, like for me in the podcast, So how is it balancing being an advocate, a active advocate, because, it's all different levels for everyone, and a caregiver at the same time?
Yeah, I think there's a tricky balance because, of course, my child and her well-being, her safety, and her health are the top priority. And that extends to my other children as well, right? I have to be focused on what is going to be good and healthy for my entire family. And I don't, at this season in my life, want to be doing other things that kind of take away from that, because I want to be fully present to them. And advocating for all of these things can take a lot of time. And so I just try to be really intentional about where I'm investing my efforts and my energy. And that's why I've kind of even shifted and evolved over the years, where at one point I was super involved with keeping up with my CVI blog. I still have it. I still update, but right now it's not where I can really invest my time and energy. And then now that Rosalie is 6 years old and she is more mobile, and I'm trying to go out in the community and, find friends and socialize with her and give her those experiences, accessibility and inclusion is really at the forefront of that. And so that's why right now, since I recently launched another page that focuses all about inclusive play, I feel like I'm able to focus on that right now because it's something that I'm living in my everyday life all the time, constantly right now. And it was the same thing with her CVI diagnosis when she was younger. We were making so many big changes early on. Everything was totally new. And it's because that's kind of where we were in our lives and what I was living every single day that I could just kind of document it, as we go along. And it's kind of the same now with the inclusive play page, where this is kind of where we're at right now in this journey. And so for me personally, I kind of try to just focus on whatever is relevant right now, because for me, I find that to be a little bit easier to just talk about or share or advocate for the issues that are really impacting me here and now, but also looking towards the future and seeing how is this going to be impacting me kind of down the road, and starting to be a little proactive about advocating for some of those things. Maybe it wasn't on my radar when she was younger, but now I'm aware and now it's on my radar, and this is a huge thing that's important. So
like accessibility in the bathrooms, is that like an example you're thinking? Accessibility in the restrooms? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. That's something that same thing with me. Like, right now, Noah, I can still carry him, but as he gets bigger, I'm going to need bigger restrooms and more help. And, when we start using his chair, I need to be able to smoothly get to the location. And it's just one of those things that I'm glad that you're saying this. It's okay to advocate with what you're living with presently, because maybe that's going to make you more successful, because you're going to have, an easier time. Be like, okay, this is what I'm encountering right now. This is what I'm dealing with right now. And this is the bandwidth that I have right now. Right. And I think that's just really great to hear, because no parent is doing less by not having an Instagram page. But if there are ways that, you can advocate with what you're dealing with right now, hey, go for it, because we cannot have enough advocates, speaking up for all these things that are not there. And you said something very crucial is, if these playgrounds are so expensive and they're limited, that does not help families, because if they have to travel, for example, in your story, from you picking up your sons to school, it's not the same thing being able to immediately have some playtime then, okay, well, now I have to accommodate commuting, and then figuring out it doesn't fit in my family's schedule. And if there's a kid that requires the medications, thinking about that too, and, being able to give the medications on time. So your story is wonderful to hear because not only because you've been successful, but because it showcases the importance of like being able to start speaking up and seeing like, what can we do about it?
Yeah. And I wish that so much of the fight and the advocating did not fall upon the shoulders of the people who are also trying to just keep their kids alive and navigate all of these other things with, whether it's prescriptions or the educational system or the hospital system. Like, we're advocating in every aspect of our lives. We're constantly researching. Like, I think that parents living this rare disease life are just always inundated with tasks. And so I really do wish that so much of it didn't fall to us. But I also think that we have really powerful experiences and we have powerful voices. And I think that our stories need to be shared and can really open people's eyes to the reality of this type of medical life who are not as exposed and they're just not as aware. They're not as educated. I mean, I did not know that much about disability access or inclusion. I knew a little bit prior to having Rosalie, but it's very different when it's your lived reality and you're experiencing these things personally on a day-to-day basis. And so I do think that caregivers have a lot of, potential for just raising awareness and opening eyes and opening hearts and helping to get other people on board with something that's really important for our society.
Yes. Do you have, for our audience that's listening, and maybe those caregivers or parents that want to be a little more proactive, do you have any like resources that you would say, hey, this is where you can start, or simply just go ahead and like search this side, or even advice if someone were like, you know what, specifically, I want to do what Stephanie did. And, I have this playground in mind, what words of wisdom or resources can you share with them so that they can just start taking one step forward on the right direction?
Yeah. Well, I do think that on my Stephanie Bluebird's page, I have a highlight section. I think I labeled it Advocacy or something like that. Yeah. And it's one that I just created with kind of a little bit of more information about some specific things that I've done personally, like advocating to get some accessible parking spaces in a parking lot that didn't have any. And then, of course, the playground and things like that. So people could always go check that out and just see like, well, what have I done? And maybe that'll spark ideas. But a lot of what I have done just involves figuring out kind of what the problem is and then figuring out who do I talk to about it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're not sure, like, is this a city thing? Is this like private property? Is this like a school thing? Is it, the county? Like, who do I need to talk to? And kind of piecing together, like, where do I go from here? And once you find the people that you need to talk to, I find that really kind of allows you to gain a lot of traction with then speaking up and getting more plugged in. I will say if you are interested in trying to advocate for an inclusive playground in your town, because unfortunately most places don't even have one, and we're forced to drive really far away just so our kids can play, I would turn towards either your town council or your local parks and rec department, one or the other. A lot of times you can go online, find phone numbers or emails, or they might even have a contact form on their website, and just introduce yourself and just say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I live in this community, and I've noticed that we don't have any inclusive playgrounds. I would love to chat with you about what your plans are, for any future projects or playground renovations, and would love to know how I can get involved or who I can talk to. I think a lot of it is just talking to people, talking to everybody, figuring out who to talk to, and then getting your message across and following up with people. Because I did that a lot with that playground project, a lot of follow-up when I'm not hearing anything. And, people are human and they have other, depending on what their job is, whatever their position is, some balls might get dropped. So be the squeaky wheel, because that is the one that gets the oil. And that is 100% my lived experience as a disability advocate within my community, is to just be the squeaky wheel and do it with kindness.
Yes.
Respect. Yes. I would say give people the benefit of the doubt that they probably don't know. They're probably not aware that this is a problem. In my experience, most people, once I tell them and I can give them examples of why this is like an obstacle for my family, they're like, oh, they want to do something about it, but they just might not have that awareness or the knowledge or the resources. So that's kind of been my strategy, is to really just try and partner with people and give people grace and give them the benefit of the doubt that they probably do want to help and they don't know how.
Yes, that's absolutely beautiful. And I think we need to hear that. Just kind of like a nice, encouraging, like pep talk. So we're like, okay, yes, let's approach this from zero. Be like, hey, I'm so-and-so, and this is my situation. And, I cannot push my son or daughter through the mulch, things people might think about that. Like, have you tried that? It's not possible, or, he has very little neck control and trunk control. And we really want to get them to use those swings. We love this park, and I can't obviously sit on the swing with them, those things like that. So this is really, really helpful. And I love to ask this question at the end of the podcast, because I feel it's just, it's beautiful in the sense that there's a lot of parents like us out there. And the question is, if you could go back in time to Stephanie when she first received the diagnosis and she was pregnant, and the diagnosis stage is just, it's so overwhelming. You're just like, okay, what does this mean? This is not what I expected. If you could go back in time and give her some words of wisdom, because now you're at a different spot in your journey, what words of wisdom would you give to Stephanie then, or parents who are newly diagnosed that are just learning that it's going to be a different road ahead of them? And that may include a diagnosis of an illness or syndrome or disabilities. So what kind of advice would you give to them?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Stephanie, and to young Stephanie, yes.
I guess a couple things. So first, I always like to tell people that, it's okay to grieve. It is totally normal. It is totally healthy. Anytime that something happens differently in life than what you envisioned or what you planned, there can be a sense of loss. And you have to acknowledge that and accept it for what it is, and give yourself the time to process, give yourself the time to grieve, but then find a way to move forward. And for me personally, that was always finding like actionable items, things that I could focus on. But it's going to be different for everybody. What's going to kind of motivate you or help you throughout that grieving process and getting to acceptance. And then also, I think I would say that it doesn't necessarily get easier, but you are going to get better. Yeah. You are going to be better equipped. You are going to find resources. You are going to find tools. You're going to be introduced to people who are going to be instrumental in guiding you on your journey, whether those are people in real life or people on social media. But you are going to gain a lot of knowledge. You're going to gain tools. You're going to gain insights. And so you are going to get better at taking in new information, pivoting when it's necessary, prioritizing and balancing, because you are going to, be able to figure that out for your lives and for your family, what you can do, what you can handle, and where your priorities are going to lie. And you're going to have better tools to do that. And then I guess one final thing would just be that, I know early on in my journey, I felt so much pressure all the time to do everything, to know everything that I could possibly know, to do all of the therapies that we could possibly do. And I remember that was kind of hard, even with early intervention therapists coming into our home. Sometimes I had to really rush through certain routines because they're coming, and, it can create like a lot of stress. And it wasn't until Rosalie got a little bit older that there were certain things that would happen on certain days where I would say, you know what? I'm just going to cancel therapy and it's going to be okay. Like my child just had a really bad seizure, or she's really tired and didn't sleep well, or, something has happened where this is just not going to be the ideal learning environment for her, or what have you. And learning that it is okay to not do all of the things and to not do all of the therapies, and to also acknowledge that, our children are people who have lots of needs, just like everyone else. And just because we have a lot of big goals and have to work on things that maybe a lot of other people don't have to work on, and we feel this sense of urgency, it doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice all those other aspects of quality of life and health and well-being. And it is okay to strive for a balance. And that's okay. That's really okay.
I love it. I absolutely love it, because you're reminding parents and caregivers to be kind to yourself. And that's so, so important. That's just, you just have to be like, you have to be thinking about you too, and being exactly like you said. You have to be like, in this moment, it's okay to cancel. It's okay not to get this done. And that I still have to constantly remind myself of that. So it was nice to hear that reminder. And I really appreciate you. And I know the audience really appreciates everything you said today. And I'm thankful for, again, you answering my messages on Instagram, because this journey, when you think, I'm like, oh, maybe it was a one-time seizure, or maybe it's just like a visual impairment, then you understand CVI, you're like what's going on? What is going on? I have to do all of this. And my son is nonverbal, so there comes a different layer on that. But with that said, Stephanie, I know you're busy. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to join us and to tell your story and give us so much advice from your experiences. I really, really appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much. It was just a joy to be here and to speak with you. And I'm so glad that we finally got to chat, not quite in person, but, to kind of connect more face to face. Right. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much. You have a great day.
You too.